Okay, so we're just going to continue on with JavaScript. We're going to go over how to print the current date, how to do include of JavaScript files into both the head and the body of our HTML page. And then also we'll talk about forms and how to, if you want to have a print screen on your program. So, on your web page, if you want to have someone hit a button and print the screen. All right, so just very quickly, a little review. This slide comes up a few times. We basically have a web server. So if you're connecting to Twitter, Twitter is your web server. This is your client. That could be your computer or your cell phone. And you're sending a message, an HTTP request to the server. The server could send you HTML files or PHP files back to you. Those files, those HTML files, could have includes in them to then bring over JavaScript files also to your client. So these could come over as a pair. This could be like considered a sister file to this HTML file. This HTML file is bringing that file in. Okay, so here's some examples of some code. So JavaScript to get the current day and year. So what we can do is we can have in a paragraph, an HTML paragraph, we can put in a JavaScript. JavaScript starts here, ends here. Paragraph ends here. We could have a variable today, it's a name we've made up, and we create a date object. The date object provides all the time of day information, day, month, year, hours, minutes, seconds, everything you need to know about the current time on the client, not on the server. So if the server's in California and the client is in New Jersey, it's going to be New Jersey time. Okay, then we could write out to the document the current date, semicolon, and then right after that we write out to the document, we use the today object that we created, and we call the toDate string function, which takes the date and writes it to a string. So that's one paragraph. Another paragraph could be, again, get the date function, is today. We could put in the copyright symbol and a non-breaking space. And then we could say today and call the function get full year. And it will write out the full year. And then we could say, whatever our town hall name is. So that web page would generate something like this as soon as you loaded the page. So we get the current date, and then the copyright, the year, and then the name of our hometown. Okay. So a script element in the head section that loads the external file would go something like this. In your HTML file, you would put in your script, you say script, source equals, and then you name the file. Now there's no absolute path. It's not http:// and then what server it's on and then what the file name is. So this would be a file that's in the same folder on the same server as the HTML file that's calling it in. So this could be like a setDate.javascript file, and it could have a whole bunch of code in that file, JavaScript code. Okay. So now there's two parts to every HTML web page. There's the head part, it starts here, ends here, and the body part. So have you guys in your HTML class, have you gone over why there's a head and a body? Has that come up? But you've used the head and the body, right? So like for example, in the head you could put the title of your page, which appears on the tab. But another thing is, when a web page is sent from a server to a client, the head is sent first, and if there's no error in the head, then the body would come second. So you can do validity checking in the head because you don't want, maybe there's some information in the body you don't want the client to see if they're not authorized to see it. So you can do your validation in the head part, because the head part is not visible. Only the body part is visible. So we can put JavaScript code in the head or the body, because it's not supposed to be visible on the browser. It runs and then its output could be visible on the browser. So we can have a function. Now this is a very common thing that JavaScript programmers do. In JavaScript, you're allowed to have a variable equal a function. That's it's also allowed in C++. That's a very unusual thing, to allow a variable to equal a function. So in JavaScript, we can have a variable $, and it's just a popular convention to use the $, to become the function. You pass in an identifier, and it returns to you the document, and it calls the getElementById, because getElementById is called all the time in JavaScript. Basically, all JavaScript is doing is modifying HTML, and HTML is all made up of elements. So we're saying get this element and modify it. So we don't want to keep typing getElementById over and over and over. So it's popular, I don't know where the $sign came from, but it's popular to assign $, to equal the function that gets the element by ID. So once we do that, now we could use $, instead of typing all that. Now here on this the next call, window on load. So as soon as the page is loaded, we'll define this function. There's another function. We're going to say variable today equals getDate object. And then we're going to say $, which basically means get me the element whose ID is the date in the HTML file. Go to its first child. So now the date could have, first child means it's a linked list of elements. So I'm going to go to the first child, and then I'm going to say the node value, the value that will be displayed, will be current date followed by our date object, today, dot, and then I'm going to run the toDate string. Okay. So what's nice about having this function, $sign equaling this, is we don't have to keep typing out the getElementId. Makes things much faster. Okay. Okay, now JavaScript embedded in the body, we could also put same code in the body. Okay, so we can have variable today equals new date, current date equals, right, same as before. We print it out right into the document. Okay. All right, so now here's code from full web page. We have an HTML document. We have the header. The header is come join our email list. In the body, we say, please join our email list. And we create a form. A form is where somebody can type in answers to questions. Okay, so the ID for the form, in case we want to run some JavaScript on it, is email_form. And the name of the form will be email_form. The action will be, so if somebody fills out the form and hits the button, enter, the enter button, we're going to send the results of the form data to a file called join.php. So PHP is the server-side programming language that will read the form and process it on the server side. And it's going to be a get method. Okay, so the label will be, for the email address, we'll actually print out email address semicolon. That'll be the label to let the person know here's where you put in your email address. We're going to ask for input, and the input identifier is going to be email_address. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put a span. Now span, if you remember from your HTML course, the span is something that we can use in JavaScript to alter its value. So right now it doesn't have any value. It just has the star. It has no value, but we can use it to put error messages on it. Okay. All right. So this is at a very high level, the document object model. We have the HTML. The HTML has two parts to it, the head and the body. The head has a title, and the title can have some text. We can also put validation code and also CSS code and stuff like that in the header. The body can be made up of many headlines and forms and many other things, but this is just kind of keeping it simple. So we could have a label where the input is, and then we could have a span which could have some text on it. Okay. All right. So the DOM normally commonly used for scripting or elements, attributes, and text. Okay. So, document object model, very, very common function that's called is get me the element and pass in an ID. We can do a write on a string. Okay, examples of document methods might be like variable rate box equals document.get element by ID, ask for the rate, and then we capture its value. We could write out things like today is, and then put out today's date. And like I said before, the standard $sign function to get an object by its element ID is almost always written like this. It's also included in the jQuery library if you use that, so you wouldn't even have to write this out. But this is extremely common in all applications to have this function created. Okay, so scripting in the DOM. 3 properties of scripting in the DOM is the value of the field. If the field can have multiple dynamically created children, you have a first child, and then from the first child you could go to the next child and the next child. And then each of the nodes on your linked list have a value to them. Okay. So how to get text from an HTML file, we could do something like this. We could use the predefined now $, which means I pass in an element ID and I get the element that has that ID. And then I go and get its value. And its value could be then set to a JavaScript variable, we'll call it email address. How to set the text, if you know that the element ID is email underscore error, we could go to the first child of it, because we could have a linked list of errors, and then set its node value to, let's say the error message was entry is invalid. So this is how we can read the values from the web page and write the values to the HTML so it would be displayed again. So the events that go on in the document object model is the page gets loaded. Right, when you go to a web page, page gets loaded, and then an event occurs. You could type something into a form and hit enter. We could have on-click programs that if someone clicks on a button, an event occurs. So when an event occurs, that's going to cause a script to run. Some JavaScript, not even a script to run, sometimes just a function within a script to run. So then what does JavaScript code do? JavaScript code modifies the existing HTML. So for example, if it's popular to have links on a web page be in blue, and then if you click on the link, obviously you go to the web page, but then if you come back to your original page, now the link is like maroon. And that means you've already been to that website. So the blue ones are the websites you haven't been to, and the maroon ones are the ones you have been to. All right, so then we're modifying the document object model. So that's essentially what JavaScript does. It modifies the web page. And so then the page, after you modify the document object model, the page gets reloaded. The page gets updated, and then it goes back and gets reloaded. Right? And this keeps going like a cycle. Okay. All right. So let's say we wanted to write an application where somebody wanted to update their, sign up for our email. So we would have an HTML document. We'd have a head section. Head starts here, ends here. We'd say in our title, join our email list. Okay, we could put in style sheets if we want, some CSS. And then we can have a script, email list.javascript, that would be a sister file that comes over with this code. And in that file has methods that we can call. Okay, so now we'll say, please join our email list. That'll be in highlight 1. And then we have a form. The form, we're going to have an email form. That'll be its ID and its name. Our action is going to be to send the results of the form, the data of the form, back to a file on the server called join.php. It's again a get method. We have a label for the address 1. It'll actually say address, email address semicolon. And then there'll be a text box where the person can type in their email address. And then we're going to have a span, and the span is going to be an error message for email address 1. So it's just there in case something goes wrong, and we have to put out an error message. So now this file keeps going on to the next slide. We now have a label for email address number 2. So when you join websites, a lot of times they'll ask you, what is your email address? And they don't want you to type it in and be off by one letter and then create an account for you. So a lot of times they'll ask you to type your email address in twice, and they'll check that they match identically. Otherwise, they think maybe you mistyped something and make you start over. Okay. So the next thing on the form would say re-enter your email address, and then the input type is text. We're going to give it a name because we're going to send the data to the server, and the server has to anticipate these names coming. And so then we'll have email address 2, and we'll have another span in case we need to write out an error message. So we now have 2 spans, one for email address 1, one for email address 2. We're going to now also in the same form, we're going to ask the person for their first name, say first name, and then we're going to have a variable to capture the first name and a text field, and then we're going to have an error message possibly for the first name. Okay, and then lastly, we're going to have a button. And the button, if you hit the button, it's going to, the identifier for that button is going to be join list, and the value which will appear on the button will be join our list. So that's the end of our form, that's the end of the main part of our, the body, and that's the end of our body, and that's the end of our HTML page. Okay, so that code would generate a page that looks like this. So now what we can do is we can type in, so it'll say in big letters, please join our email list. We can type in an email address, and then where it says re-enter your email address, if you leave it blank, this is our span. This is our span. Now right here, there's a span here, but you can't see anything because there's no error message. But this span, our JavaScript is going to replace it by saying this entry must equal the first one. So the error here is that this field does not match this field, so you're going to get an error message. In addition to that, the person left out their first name. That first name is, they left it blank, and that generated an error message. So now we have 2 error messages on this page. And the whole point behind doing this is we don't want to send these answers, the answers the person put on the form. We don't want them to hit this button and send these answers back to the server, the PHP, join.php code, which is now going to read these and process them. So if that code back on the server is written well, it's going to bounce these answers back and say, I'm not accepting them anyway. So rather than have the person fill out the form incorrectly, hit enter, send the message back to the server, and the server has to process this, it would be nice to have the JavaScript do some preliminary checks and just put out these messages. So when the person hits enter, if the JavaScript code checking this catches the problem, nothing gets sent to the server, so you're not wasting the server's time. And the server's time is very important, because like on Twitter, all the people connecting to Twitter are constantly sending messages. So if you could do some checking on the clients before you send anything, that would be great. Okay, so, all right, so the JavaScript code, the code for the file that we included, email_JS, we again, through this, this is, like I say, this is everywhere in JavaScript. So $ equals the function that you give it an ID and it returns the element to you. So we have a variable called join list, which is a function. The function basically will we'll have a variable called email address 1 and set it to the email address value that is passed in. So we're going to take the email address 1 element and take its value field and assign that to one of our local variables. We're going to do the same thing for email address 2. So we're going to start off by assuming that the entire form is filled out valid. So even the way this form was filled out, if someone typed something here and left these 2 blank and hit enter, we're going to read this field and this field, and immediately assume the form is valid. And then if we notice something's wrong, we're going to change that flag to say it's invalid. All right, so here's what we're going to do. If email address 1 double equals means not assigned to, but is equivalent to a blank, then we're going to go get the element ID called email address 1 error, which is the span that holds an error message. We're going to go to the first child, because it could be a linked list of spans. And we're going to go to the node value, and we're going to say this field is required. So if they leave email address 1 out and hit enter, they're going to get a red error message that says this field is required. So all we're really doing here is we're just putting the value in this string, this field is required, we're putting that into the span element. And we're also setting our flag saying is valid is now false, meaning we found something wrong with this form. We're not going to take the data from the form and send it to the server. We're going to go back to the person and say fix the form. Okay. Now the code continues. If email address 1 does not equal email address 2, open paren, then we go get the email address 2 error span, which is a dead space in case we need to write an error to. It could be a linked list, so we get the first child and we have its node value set to this entry must equal the first entry. So now that's a different error. So we also say that is valid is false. That means we found something wrong with the form. Now if we found 2 things wrong, it's still false. It means if 1 or more things is wrong with the form, we're not going to send the data to the server. We're going to ask the person to fix their form. If this is not the case, then email address 2, the error message, the span, is going to be blank, so we don't have to tell them anything. Then blah, 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 later on we say if is valid. If we have found nothing wrong with the form, then we would submit the form. So we can just say get me the form, the email form, get me the element, and then I'll hit the submit button, meaning we'll submit it and therefore send the data to the server. Okay. And then we can set up our window that as soon as the page is loaded, the join list would happen as soon as there's a click. Okay. And now the other thing is this. Suppose we wanted to print the page, right? So you know how sometimes you're on a web page and obviously you can right-click the page and then pick print out of the menu, but sometimes the page is all screwed up. You'd like it to be a printable type of page. So what we can do is this, once again, $, this is getting like obnoxious seeing this over and over. The $, equals the function where you get elements by their ID. Okay, so we can have a variable print page. Print page is now equal to a function, and the function will call window.print, which will print the page. So then we could say the window on load function is going to go and get the print page element, and on click it will call print page. And this is a function. This is this function. So if you click on the print button, it will print the page. And we can put this code into a printpage.js JavaScript file and then include it this way. So any of these functions that are very common, you might as well package them together into JavaScript files. Okay. So then you could, in your HTML for the print page, you can have a button that goes something like this. The type is a button. This is pure HTML. The ID is print button, and then you could say, you know, print this page. Okay, and I think that's it. All right, great. So does anybody have